Great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Food Systems Leadership Network's online training, Make Yourself Obsolete, Shifting Power from Nonprofit Leadership to Community Leadership. I'm Annalena Kazikis with the Wallace Center, and I am joined today by Jen Dalton and Miles Gordon of Kitchen Table Consulting, who are going to be leading us through this training. Today is the second and final session of this two-part series. We had a great time last week and are glad to see so many familiar faces and names. So welcome back to those of you who were here before, and welcome to those of you who it's the first time joining us. Great to have you. So this training today is hosted by the Wallace Center's Food Systems Leadership Network. The FSLN is a national peer learning community of almost 3,000 food systems leaders. We focus on connecting current and emerging leaders, strengthening individual and collective leadership capacity, and fostering collaborations across communities with the goal of accelerating the realization of a just, equitable, and sustainable food system. This training, like the others that we offer, are recorded and archived on our website. So if you're not already a member, we'll be sending out a link with more information and instructions to join after the call. This is a really fantastic and growing community to tap into for technical and leadership support and to just build a network of peers and sense of camaraderie. So hope you'll join us. And before we do jump in and get started, I just want to share a few Zoom tips with you. On the bottom left of your screen, or on the bottom of your screen is a toolbar or the control panel, and on the bottom left is the option to mute or unmute. Please stay muted throughout the session until we get to the Q&A and small group discussions. Feel free to use the chat box to ask any questions and introduce yourselves. Always fun to see where people are calling in from. And then the chat box and the raise your hand option are also great for asking questions. My colleague Andrew Carberry is also on the call here today, and we're both here for any tech support. So feel free to message us directly if you have any trouble. Okay, so let me just introduce our trainers for today, Jen and Miles. Jen and Miles bring over 2 decades of food systems development and community engagement work as program directors working for a variety of nonprofit organizations and a wealth of expertise, including in leadership development, multi-stakeholder engagement, and group facilitation. They work at the local, regional, national, and international levels with clients engaged in community empowerment, organizational leadership, sustainable communities, systems development, and change implementation. Jen and Miles are close partners of the Wallace Center and the FSLN, and Miles serves as an FSLN mentor. The two of them have hosted a few different conference sessions, including the session that today's training is adapted from. So Jen and Miles, thank you again so much for being here and for walking us through the second session. I'll hand it over to you guys to get us right started.
Great, well, thank you. First of all, glad to see so many people back, as well as we had several new people that weren't at the first session. So we're going to do a quick review for both people, for both those who were here last session and new folks, so we're all on the same page. But I wanted to acknowledge and thank those who gave some very thoughtful comment, not only in the chat, but in the evaluations of the first session. Jen and I have taken that, and we hope to address some of your questions and comments as we go through today. And one of the comments was that there was a very rich chat box discussion going on throughout. Sometimes we directed people, but sometimes it was ongoing. And some people found that to be really distracting, to say, wait, there's all this interesting chat box, and what are the presenters saying? So you're all adults. We're going to kind of leave it up to you, but we recommend that you stay focused on the presentation itself until we direct you to go to the chat box. Obviously, if you feel like you want to spend some time there, but it's definitely something that as we move into the virtual world that needs some balance and some thinking about. How do I approach this when there's sort of side conversation going on in that? So just be aware that that was an issue for some people and how you might find yourself managing that. A couple of other things just on logistics in the Zoom world. Jen and I are both in rural Northern California. We're kind of buried in smoke. There's been fires and our internet does drop out. It's been pretty good lately. So if we drop out, we will call back in, but Annalena will keep it going until we come back on. And just interestingly enough, yesterday we were in something similar and we got a text that there was a fire right over the hill. So we had to leave until the bombers put out the fire. So It's just that time. It's 2020, but we hope today and we plan on today going very smoothly without interruptions. So with that said, let's dive in and welcome everybody. So Jen, you want to talk about the agenda today?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And it's so nice to see people from all over the country and from so many different types of work. One thing we did talk about last week too, that we're not going to review, but it's just that this work is for everybody. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But last time we spent a lot of time setting the stage for today's conversation. And for those of you who didn't get a chance to listen in on the recording, we are going to do a quick review, as Miles said, a quick review of the concepts and ideas and inherited things that we need to acknowledge and release in order to shift our mindsets towards shifting power from nonprofit organizations to community leadership. And then we shared a 4-part process about how specifically you can go about shifting power and continuing to fulfill on our mutual missions. Today, we're going to go from those concepts into action. So we're going to share examples from 3 community-driven programs, a food hub, a community garden program, and a farm-to-school program. And then we're going to use a worksheet, which you may have gotten in an email from Annalena prior to this, but we're going to share it in the chat box again. And we're going to look at your programs and whether you're designing or redesigning, or you've done some of this work before or you haven't. We're going to take some time to start talking about what you all are up to. And we're going to do a quick review. As part of that quick review, we wanted to reshare with you all kind of where we come from. And first of all, we're just regular people. And we're, may have some expertise, but we also acknowledge the expertise in this group of people. We come from a position of caring a lot about and working towards equity and community wealth. Consider ourselves to be anti-racist, but we acknowledge that we probably have lots of blind spots that we're still working on. We also acknowledge that we're complicit in the white supremacist system because we benefit from it as white people. But we also like to think that we are accomplices working to change the current system, which is a lot of what today's and this boot camp is really about. And that this is based on our observations and experiences working in nonprofit sector. We also want to remind you of the 2-foot rule. So when we're in person, we always tell people, well, use your 2 feet. If this isn't for you, feel free to move on, go to another session or whatever. But since we're on Zoom, feel free to leave the meeting, and we totally understand and we won't take it personally.
And then again, just to remind people, Jen and I are going to use the words we and us frequently. We're talking about literally Jen and I. You might find relevance, and we hope you do in certain things. We're cisgendered white people, and the examples we share are from the communities that we're from and we're a part of, and the nonprofits where we have worked not only in Northern California, but across the nation. So today, we're getting back into session 2. Our objective is shifting or affirming your program and project to be it's our project to be community driven. It's all about really putting that power back in community. And one of the things that came up from the last week's session was, what is community? People were struggling, well, I'm part of my community. How does that play out? So the relevant issue for us is, how does power manifest itself? Is the power coming from the top or the bottom? Is it hierarchical or not? So when you think about community, even if you're part of that community, it can look very different. I'm part of the community. Well, if you're holding power within your community through either your position or your privilege, then it's, how do I shift power out of myself within my own community? Communities can manifest itself as a nonprofit organization, could be a community in itself. You could say, oh, this is the community where I want to shift power. That right now, all the decisions, the power, the wealth is at the top of my nonprofit, and at the bottom of those are the lowest paid workers that don't have any to say. Well, I want to use this process to see how I can shift within my organization. A community could also be a national network. So there's different ways of looking at this, where again, the leadership of the national network might hold all of the power and the decision making, and those at the bottom of the network who are supposed to be served by it don't really have as much say or don't have as much power. So it can be used, the community in this process, in a national network too. It could be a brick and mortar place, like a Head Start school. Hey, I'm part of that. That's a nonprofit. Well, if the teachers, the administrators, or the administrators in particular might have all the power and decision making, but the lowest paid assistants, cooks, or even the families don't have a lot of say in what happens. This process can be used to shift that power and start thinking about how even in a brick and mortar community like a Head Start school, things can start being moved. So the community, it created a lot of great questions about what is community. And so we want to give you some examples. It can be anything, but it's really thinking about how power manifests itself, because that's really what this is about. It's about shifting power. So I hope that helped. If some questions come up, hold those and we can come back to those. So quick review. We talked about what you have internal conditions. When you're holding on to power, what do you have to acknowledge and release? Well, privilege. We all come with certain privileges, or not we all, but we come with certain privileges, and maybe you do too, like attending this workshop. And ego. How does ego get in the way of releasing power? We want recognition. Feels good to be in charge. We like to claim success. We're working to move up job positions, income stability. We have to really focus and acknowledge, like, oh, right, I hold those, and what do I have to let go of to start transferring power? So internal conditions, we have to really recognize those first. We also talked about external conditions.
And these are inherited structures. And typically there are structures that are built on white supremacy and the supremacy of capital over people. And I like to think of it as like we're the fish swimming in the water, but we don't know the water's all around us. And I think a lot of us are learning more and more about like, well, how does white supremacist culture manifest itself in the workplace? But there's also parts of ourselves that we bring to that. So we talked a little bit about the white savior idea, or the savior complex in any way that it manifests, just this idea that like, I have to go out there and help some people. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm a bad person, or they need my help, which doesn't acknowledge the fact that they know how to help themselves. And then of course, it brought up a whole conversation about the word help, and that we could be shifting the way we use that word, which was a really great point to bring up. There was a lot of great discussion in the chat box, and thank you so much when we talked about gender structures, and it really brought up a lot of really wonderful conversation around gender roles. But it also reminded us that we needed to be more specific, I guess, about what our and clarify what our point is about this. But it's really that there are very different structures at play. Some are hierarchical and others are collaborative. Some are top down and some are bottom up. And so we just wanted to to highlight those. And that we've talked a little bit too about our grant structures and how they're based on capitalist structures. And so they're very competitive. Everything's measured in numbers and return on investment, sometimes with unrealistic timeframes and outcomes, and there's very little recognition or places to record important things like relationship building or cultural relevancy, or these little things that happen in communities where we just don't get a box where we get to say, hey, this happened, and it's an important part of the process. So those external conditions are important to acknowledge as we begin to shift our mindsets around power and how we can shift it.
Great. So once we've acknowledged those internal and external we talked about last week, we sent you this sort of cheat sheet on, it's really, we've created this, taken a lot of the ideas that are out there and tried to make it really simple to think about what do I have to do to shift that power? And part one was that idea of, it's the foundation. You have to build this sense of community. It's relationship building. It could be within an organization. It could be in a neighborhood, between organizations, making connections, helping uncover the common values of that community, not necessarily of what the grant application you got. It's about information sharing, having people have the same information in that community, identifying and elevating the experience, wisdom, and skills in a community. So it's not just looking at the nonprofit leadership for that, but it's recognizing those. Part two, once that was done, is we have some background. If people can mute there, some background. There is part two is identifying community assets. Once those values have been uncovered and relationships built, what does the community want to do? Let them decide what the outcomes would be, and then backwards plan, decide, and help them find out what are the resources and skills they already have. There's a ton of expertise in our communities. We need to help them uncover those and share those, and then identify what they still need for self-sustaining. And then determine what our organizations can do, or you are doing now, that you don't need to be doing. Do you need to be making the phone calls? Do you need to be setting the agendas? Do you need to be controlling the money? because whoever does the work owns it. Part 3 was then once you've identified the needs, then help mobilize the resources. We can do that as nonprofits and people with power. We can say, okay, great, you all need training on this, you've said, in advocacy or conflict resolution. Either there's somebody in your community or we can bring somebody to help bring those skills to your community. We have access to resources. We can help transfer money, land, equipment to communities. And we can build support networks with communities. So they don't look for us continually for support as individuals or nonprofits. We have them looking to each other and knowing each other so they can support each other. And what I was really glad to see is not only was it a big aha moment for a lot of people, but there was a lot of people acknowledging and giving ideas how they already do this, is valuing people's time. If we're having them come to a training, we're having them do the work, we should be valuing their time. We get paid, they should get paid. Does that look like money or stipends? CEUs, continuing education units that people can get credit for. So that was key. People were really glommed onto that, and I was glad to see that. And then sometimes the hardest part is at the end. It's like, I just need to be patient and get out of the way. Check our urge to fix things and take it over. Let things fail a little bit. Let the community take ownership and say, oh, this is falling apart. We need to get in there. And if there's a challenge, see it as an insight. Maybe there's a new training that needs, another resource that they need. And then, of course, for ourselves, know that we don't have to own this project or program. We need to say, if I'm getting out of the way, what am I going to do next in my own life? So that's where we ended at the beginning of session 1. So we wanted to, in the chat box, just take a moment for clarifying questions or anything about what was sort of handled in session 1, things that came up in between that people might say, you know, I need some more clarity on this, or what about this? So we're going to take about 5 minutes for people to put ideas in the chat box about kind of that inherited structures, inherited internal conditions, and the 4-part process before we get into real examples of what this looks like through 3 different examples and your own work. So I'll look to Jen maybe and others to sort of pull up any questions that we can respond to. People can look at the chat box, see what's coming.
Here's a good one. Why, in all caps, is it important to shift power to the community?
Great question. Well, you know, one of the things that we looked at, and I mean, this is a great question for you to ask, maybe yourself or your organization, is that looking at our missions and our goals, we talked about that on the first session, is what people's missions were. And a lot of them were about, you know, social justice or eliminating hunger or creating more power in our communities. And if we want to really have those missions be part of what is done, nonprofits typically fill a pattern of band-aiding things that aren't working in our system. And if we want to get to the root of a lot of these issues, you have to stop thinking about being a permanent band-aid. And you're a permanent band-aid if you hold on to power. And if we start letting the communities decide what they really want, you're going to often, most likely, end up with outcomes that are more appropriate to that community, that they have some ownership over and are willing to be accountable for what happens in those processes. If we keep the power, it's not necessarily going to be the right thing for the community. And if things aren't going well with the process, the community doesn't really take ownership of the process. We do. So it's really about not only the idea of power, it's about effectiveness of meeting missions and goals. I hope that kind of addresses some of that. That's the big why we're talking about it. You might have different reasons.
Well, it's also about sustainability. So something is more likely to be sustained. You know, those missions are more likely to be sustained when the community, you know, is owning the work, and it becomes something that's just a part of the culture of the community, the way people do things, instead of, oh, well, this nonprofit over here had this idea for a project. They came in, tried to implement it. They did it for a couple of years. The funding ran out, and now what happened? And so it's really a way in which to engage that sustainability piece as well.
Great.
Someone else asked, is the assumption that in order to enact the 4-step process that you already have to be in a position of power? That's a great question.
No, it'd be great if you started off without that. That's why we talk about it. It's a great way to design from the beginning. This is kind of a redesign process, but if it's designed from the beginning in a community, if this is a bottom-up process, if this starts at the bottom, then you never get stuck in the trap of the non-industrial, the nonprofit industrial complex of this power shift. Yeah, so great question, but even better if it starts off without having to fix the power imbalance, but from the bottom up. Great question.
Yeah, and that's why later we're going to work on your program, and we're really going to talk about designing, you know, whether designing or redesigning from that to kind of address some of those parts of the process that can be, you know, fixed or something, so that it comes from that place to be in its design.
Can we take two more questions maybe?
How is the model of shifting power different from a shared leadership model? Another good question.
Well, it's a good question, and I guess without more detail, there's a lot of definitions of a shared leadership model. I've seen a variety of ones. I guess the question is, again, as we look into how does power manifest itself, and who owns the process, who owns the outcomes, and who owns the sort of the values that define the outcome. So those are sort of the elemental questions without knowing kind of the definition of how you define shared leadership. There's a few different models. Always ask that question: how is power manifesting itself? Who is deciding what happens, and who is owning the process and the outcomes?
And I want to address the question, and it's not really a question, but someone wrote that they feel hung up on the funding piece. They find the framework inspiring and appreciate it. And the funding piece is a question we get a lot. And I'm hoping that in the examples that we share later on, and as we begin to talk about your work a little bit more, that we can begin to address that funding piece. Because oftentimes a lot of this work does start with some outside funding in some capacity, and then can, again, as I said, begin to shift so that it's just the work of the community, and the resources show up in lots of different ways.
Great. I guess we'll hold at that, and if those questions come up, maybe we can answer in the chat box too. So good questions. So let's see what this looks like, and that might bring up some more clarity or some more questions or more challenges to think about. So what we're going to do, Jen?
We're going to go from concept into action. So we're going to dive into 3 separate examples and really show how this 4-part process, and as we mentioned, it's not a linear process, it's just things that can be done to shift power. We're going to talk about a community garden project called the Gardens Project, and I want to point out that Miles was the founder of this, and so it's a really great example of how someone had an idea and they were really inspired by it, and now all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, through lots of work, that person, the founder, is no longer involved in the project, and it's kind of running with a very small staff support. And a farm to school program that encompasses 2 counties in Northern California. And then we're going to talk about the Mendo-Lake Food Hub. And a shout out to Susan Schempf, who is with the Wallace Center and the Food Systems Leadership Network. She played a big role in helping to design the farm to school program that we'll be talking about, and the Food Hub.
So let's dive in. What does this process look like in action? So build community, step 1. The Gardens Project started off with people interested in having community gardens. And when you build community, what can that look like? Well, some of the key pieces are that you want to uncover common values. Now, on the right hand, instead of asking people to come to you for a meeting, you go to them. You go to their neighborhood. You speak in their language. This was a multilingual community, primarily Spanish speaking, so simultaneous English and Spanish. This is, for many of you, you do this already. Circle, but it goes around where people in the community are talking about their skills. You facilitate, you don't lead, you facilitate relationship building. Have them share information. Who knows what? Who knows how to start seeds? Who knows how to design a garden? They talk about it. You elevate the experiences of the community and let them talk to each other. That's a kind of a key piece. These folks said they wanted to grow their own food. They wanted to share it with their neighbors. They didn't really want to sell it. They wanted to remove light. You uncover those values, and then you elevate their experiences. That was also done by having an annual gardeners gathering. Instead of us always going to conferences as the nonprofit professionals, have the conferences for themselves. Let them share their skills. Let them be in that space of celebrating what they know and knowing each other. So that was the idea too, is this relationship building. It having them be across many, many different gardens. This is representing dozens of gardens people came together. So you help them facilitate their knowledge amongst themselves and their relationship building. And then step 2 is establishing community assets and needs. So this is, well, if they said they wanted to share food, well, what's that look like? Is it individual plots? Is it community plots? Is it going to be drip irrigation? What plot sizes will be? They determine it, because remember, if they build it, they own it. So we brought them together and had them share what they said they needed. And then they said, you know, what we do lack is we don't really know how to advocate with the landowners and that. So it highlighted for us a need for trainings. What do we need trainings on? And then step 3 is we mobilized resources. We brought together different gardeners from many different gardens. We had it in Chinese, Spanish, and English, simultaneous translation going on in different groups. We paid $500 to each gardener to attend a series of trainings. And then on the right-hand side, when we had gardeners, we had a senior garden where they weren't able to build their own garden. We helped bring those resources, not only the money, but we connected them with the California Conservation Corps. And they built that relationship now where they come and help build the gardens for those that aren't capable of it. So our job is to, 1, bring those resources to these communities, and 2, bring those skills to the communities, and value their time by paying them in whatever is valuable to them, be that money or other pieces. And then finally, and most importantly, be patient and get out of the way. You know, there might be that little kid that's cut and pulled up the wrong plant, but it doesn't matter because he owns it. It's his garden. He's happy and loving it. We let the garden leaders themselves share their garden with others. We didn't have to manage the garden. They were in charge of their own garden. They had challenges, absolutely, but they figured them out and they brought up new ideas for new trainings. And the result was that it had initial funding, this project, of some community food project grants, local grants, and fundraisers. The garden pays a small fee, each gardener. Businesses gave in-kind donations. But it's now been over 12 years running. There's over 50 gardens in 2 different counties that have a population of 150,000 people in those counties. There's over 3,500 people eating out of them. And now all those gardens are supported by 1 full-time staff and 1 Vista. And that staff person is primarily about building relationships, bringing new gardeners and new gardens together so they can support each other and identify trainings and have those trainings for them. So that's one example of how you do that in a community. Second example is a farm to school.
Yeah, so this example is kind of like a good classic example of the nonprofit organization that we both worked for, NCO, had an opportunity to apply for farm to school funding and got the funding, and we're like, okay, so now what do we do? We have this opportunity to participate in a burgeoning farm to school movement, but we have no capacity or desire to manage a farm to school program long term. And so this was a great opportunity to design from the beginning to make the organization obsolete and the people that were participating in it. But the first thing that we had to do was connect these communities. So connect the community of the food service staff and directors with local farmers and have them meet each other in their own work environments. So food service staff went to the farms and the farmers came into the food service environment and really began to learn about each other's needs and skills and resources, but primarily uncovering really what are some shared values, which was the idea that they each really cared about making sure that the kids in the community had access to fresh fruits and vegetables and had the opportunity to get good nutrition. And a piece of this too was that they each had to understand some of the constraints that were a part of one another's environment. So for example, the farmers had to understand the budgetary constraints and the timing constraints and the pressures that food service staff are typically under. And similarly, food service really began to understand, like, oh, here's what grows here in our region. Here's what some of the farmers have to offer. This is the seasonality of that thing, and start thinking about like, okay, well, given that we have these shared values, around wanting to get more fresh fruits and vegetables into our schools, what's that going to look like? And begin working on that together. So we act as facilitators of that conversation. We also facilitated establishing the outcomes, assets, and needs. And, you know, so in terms of the community of food service staff, typically this is a group of people who are told what to do a lot of the time, almost all day, because they're working under specific guidelines of the federal food service, the restrictions of food service in schools. But we created a space for them to come together and really start to look at, well, what are our visions for our community of children? And what do we need to look at in terms of our budgets for training and supplies and serving fresher foods and our equipment in order to make this work? And we facilitated the conversations for them to begin to own their own desires and visions around this, as opposed to being told what to do. And so we just listened and recorded what they were figuring out was really important for them to fulfill their values and their vision. And next slide. And then we brought the farmers and the food service staff together to, first we got funding to buy a lot of new equipment. So you can see there's like a Robocoup, we got new knives and cutting boards, some refrigeration, vacuum sealers, flash freezers, and we paid the staff stipends and gave them continuing education credits for attending trainings, and had the farmers there too, so the farmers could talk about, you know, this is our produce, this is what we're doing, here's what I like to do with it, and then sharing ideas around recipes and really creating space for everyone to take ownership of the process and the work. In addition to this, we helped facilitate the building of some support networks. So one of which was a community of practice amongst the food service directors. And the result of this was that food service directors from across 2 counties began to recognize that it could have some great benefit to the students and also to the farmers if they shared a harvest of the month topic. So instead of each school or each district having a different harvest of the month, vegetable, they were sourcing the same ones from some specific farmers, helping those farmers understand that they could do some forward contracting for these, and then learning some really great recipes around them and sharing, some cooperative buying models and things like that. And then also we created, and actually another shout out to Susan for creating Feeding Our Future, which was a conference for our local food service staff and food service directors to come and feel like they had something special, where it was a celebration of the contribution that they provide to our community of children, and inviting the farmers to come and again talk about, different produce and things that they were growing and do some planning, and really having the food service staff from across districts and across communities come together and get to know one another and feel like they were a part of something that was bigger than themselves. And we did it at a winery, and we gave them goodie bags and had like a wine reception, and just again offered continuing education credits, and just really acknowledging the importance of their collaboration. And I think that for anyone who's working in farm to school, we've learned over the years that the most important thing that we can do to continue the success of farm to school programs is to elevate the experience of the folks who work behind the line, encouraging them to taste the food, to make changes, to have ownership over what they're serving the kids, and and make them feel like that they're just like a hugely important piece of the puzzle, and take ownership around that.
And I wanted to add to that, as Jen was talking about that conference at the winery, how many of us have been paid to go to a conference and have receptions with music and wine? But when we look at those who are the least paid and doing the work, like food service staff, They never get that opportunity. So that was our goal, is to shift. Why were we putting the money towards us? Let's put the money towards our communities that we wanted, to give them that experience and elevate their experience and their knowledge and their celebration of them. So again, shifting those resources. Should it be us just getting paid, or should they be getting? Should we just get to go to conferences, or should they be? So a key shift that to consider moving forward in design.
Right, and it happened over the course of several years too. So it became something that was a part of their annual planning process, an annual, process of recognizing employees, and it became a very, very special event. And then the last piece is the being patient and getting out of the way. So in this instance, there was a lot of communication frustration that came with this, and a lot of issues around like invoicing and timing of things, and folks just had to work this stuff out and deal with that. And as an organization, we helped along the way with some invoicing and helped facilitate some conversations. But really, what it did was it led to the creation of a stronger Mendo-Lake food hub, which we'll talk about next. But the need really arose for a food hub that was going to handle some of this stuff, and it was a great segue into that organization. So we're going to talk about some of the results. So where it all started off with a specialty crop block grant, USDA Farm and School funding, but now the big takeaway is that the school districts are doing this on their own. There is no nonprofit staff involved in the farm to school program to date. The schools have taken this on their own. We've had over 100 staff trained from 9 different very small school districts and 1 incredibly large school district. And over $100,000 has been used on equipment to help them transition from heat and serve to not scratch cooking, but close to it. And as of 2019, over 14,000 pounds of food has been purchased from local county farms. And there's a very strong farm to school community that exists now without any intervention from a nonprofit organization.
Great. So last example, I'm trying to give you a little variety of ways that this manifests itself. And there's some questions coming up. We'll have a little bit of Q&A at the end of this and some comments too. So feel free to write those now or hold those as you go through. So the last one is, how do you manifest this transition in a food hub? That people traditionally think about as, run as a top-down structure. So for us, it was like, we need to start with community for this to be effective. How do we design a food hub that works for farmers and for buyers, that is focused on making sure the farmers and those who are less resourced have success and sustainability? So community, it was one, many of the farmers around here and maybe in many places live very independently and individually. They didn't really know each other and have an opportunity to share what their values were and what their desires were. And same with many of the local markets and the local restaurants. They didn't have that time to really talk about local food. So we facilitated relationship building. We brought together people, farmers, in an annual farmers convergence with buyers there, where they could talk and get to know each other, talk about their values. And we helped create an advisory council that we paid people to come to, and they had 3+ years of attending this, both buyers of produce and both farmers. And they designed it. They talked about the challenge. Remember, we're set up with this capitalist structure that's competitive. You have the buyers that are always trying to get the lowest price, the farmers that are trying to get the highest price, and it was always antagonistic. Well, our job was to facilitate a discussion for them to come up with some common outcomes. They valued local produce, all of them. They valued wanting to sustain a local food movement and the local farmers, but they had to create their own outcomes. What did that look like? So they really struggled to find that price point that just met both of their needs to make this happen. So uncovering that was a key piece. They also wanted to be able to figure out how to do wholesale packaging for a lot of these folks. How do we make sure it works for the farmers? And they uncovered all of these issues and shared information and expertise. But once that was done, it was then, okay, what do you need to come up with this? How do you want to build this food hub? What will it look like? And they said we had to get that margin to the point where it works for everybody and that price point. it has to be really low cost. We have to have very low overhead. So they started designing and talking about what that would look like. And they said, we need training for farmers to do more wholesale here. You know, that was a key piece. And the market said, we need more marketing training, how to market local produce versus these other pieces so people understand it. So they identified what they had. And we as a nonprofit said, okay, we don't need to be doing these things. Let's connect you. Let's bring those resources and connect you. So what connecting looked like on the left, it was farm to farm visits. We helped bring and paid for people to learn the tools they needed and how to use ramp up wholesale production to be able to meet those new margins. And we also brought in trainers to help do that piece. And they trained each other, some of the farmers. And then on the right, the key piece was they said, we can't afford the overhead of a traditional muted there. Somehow, am I still muted? Somehow it says I've been muted. Can you hear me? No, you can hear me? Good. So the key piece was this advisory council of farmers and buyers who own the process helped design this node process where it took containers, shipping containers, and had them designed and built with CoolBots to be dropped in several locations. So there's about 6 or 7 of these in a 2-county region where farmers were trained to bring their produce close to them so they didn't have to spend all this time off farm. There was no staffing at them. It was self-managed. They were trained on food safety. They would drop those off, and then a delivery truck would go around and pick those up and deliver it. So again, they created a very mobile process and one that was very adaptable to the needs with very low overhead to meet their value of maintaining the local food movement with an outcome of having the price point that could just work for both sides. And then it was get out of the way. And yeah, they've highlighted new challenges and struggles. You've got the node filled on the right. But one of the things they decided is because of that ownership, they said, you know, we want to be a farmer cooperative. So there's a transition now happening to how does this become the farmers running the food hub and the food hub nonprofit slowly getting out of the way. Are there challenges? Sure. But the key was that 3 years of a pre-planning process, some funding, helped on that relationship building, that ownership of the people who are going to be responsible in running the food hub over the long term, which was the farmers and the buyers, both finding value. And now over 102 farms are selling to it and over $320,000 of produce for our rural region, which is significant, is going through that with a lot of farm to school. And because of the ownership of the community, being the farmers and the buyers, when the pandemic hit, they were easily able to say, how do we meet these new needs with restaurants closing, et cetera, by shifting to a more direct home delivery model. So again, 3 different examples of how this process of shifting and being community driven looks. So we want to pause for a minute and allow about 5 minutes of, again, some chat box questions, specifically around these models, like, I don't get it, does that work, or how does that really transfer power, or any questions you might have. So I'll look to Jen and others maybe to help take a look at some of those chat box, any things to address here, yes.
One question came up already that I've been thinking on, and I don't think I've come up with a great answer yet, but maybe Miles, maybe you've got something. Is this any tips for entering that first step of building community relationships during COVID?
Great question. Is, you know, identifying people that are ready. If you're in whatever that community is, you've got your connectors in every community. Every community has their connecting point, be it a church, be it a local barbershop, be it a market person, being, you know, a specific person in an organization who knows lots of people. You know, rely on what those already established connections. You know, a lot of this stuff, we don't have to recreate the wheel, it's out there. And it's for us to sort of say, you know what, I don't need to do it all. Again, I don't need to lead it. Sometimes I just need to facilitate. And that is sometimes finding those people that are already out there. And sure, we're all challenged by being in person, but if you can hit those people that already have those connections and already are good connectors and relationship builders in those communities, then often some of that pre-work is done. So you can start positioning yourself for the hopeful sooner than later post-pandemic world.
Yeah. And another great question came in, which is, how do we slow down enough to make all of this happen while keeping everyday operations intact? And I know how busy, this is a part of it, is that we're all just like running around, just trying to keep things, the lights on, so to speak, and just kind of tackling like reactionary things, or just the programming that's going on that needs to be addressed. But I would encourage, I do a little thing called power hours, where, you just take an hour and you're just like, okay, we're going to work on this for an hour, and just carve out time to reflect and to plan, because that is a key to sustainability and this process, is that you have to make the time to really think about it. And Miles, do you have anything else to add?
I mean, one of the things we talked about in session 1 too is expectations. We have to start working on changing expectations of funders, our boards, our organization that says, this is a long game. And if we're going to do this, if we're committed to this idea of, social justice, racial justice, whatever that looks like in your communities and your missions, then this is the work we need to do. And you all have a lot of opportunities to start, when there's a new project being developed. I mean, sometimes it's harder to redesign when you're already in it, but you can start piece by piece, a little piece. And that's what we're going to get into in the workshop. Like, what are the little things we can start doing now? But every time, somebody says, hey, there's a new grant out, we need to create, what are we going to do? It's to start implementing this process. Well, first, we can't, have this every step known, even though they want it. We need to talk to the funders where we can and say, we're going to work on building relationships. We're going to work on uncovering values. And we're going to work on training people to their needs for their outcomes. So it's taking those times when the opportunity is opened to not just go, oh my God, we have 2 weeks to get this grant application in. I don't have time to ask all these things. Well, part of that 2 weeks is, we're actually going to tell the funders and talk with funders that we need to do it in a process that identifies our community. That's our outcomes, and identifying their values. That's what we want to start working on. So it's a long game, but we need to continually have that, like we said, political and spiritual intentionality of doing this work. We have to be really intentional and not lose opportunities as they arise. Any other questions? Take 1 or 2 more.
There's a lot of stuff happening in the chat. There's a lot of good questions out here. I'm having a hard time choosing one. I think that there's a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions out here about funders, and like, how do you find these funders, and how do you also, kind of work with like leadership, if you're, how do you to make that transition into these ideas with leadership, whether they're funders or just like senior level bosses and things like that. We want to talk about that for a minute?
So funders, again, this is a conversation, we all have different funders. Community-based funders certainly are easier to work with because often they have more flexibility. I mean, when we get to federal grants, it's a conversation that needs to happen. Many times, a lot of us are asked, they put out this like, hey, would you be a reviewer on the federal grant? That's out there. A lot of times that invitation's out there if you'll be a reviewer of applications. It's a great way to start to get to know people in that, in the grant world, and have that conversation on those large federal grants. But on community-based ones, it just takes calling people up and talking to them and having those conversations. Most of these are looking for that input. We're at a new time. There's a lot of organizations that are working on this right now. And maybe people can throw those in the chat box right now if they know specific funders or organizations that are shifting into how do we have funders moving capital into communities. So there's definitely organizations that people want to list those that they know of, because that's a really great avenue to start getting momentum on. And I think we have momentum now. It's sort of getting that critical mass of having more and more. I mean, if we got 166 people on this call, if 50 or 60 organizations start having those conversations with the funders and different funders, they're going to start hearing it over and over again and going, oh, this is the way we go. So again, it's the long haul, but you have to be intentional and use every opportunity to have those conversations. Take one more maybe question. Jen, is there one more that in a different area? And then we're going to get into your program.
Wait, was it? I think there were 2 questions about where did the ideas that were discussed come from, the organization or the community?
Which ideas? The ideas of this process of how to do this, or which ideas are we referring to, we think?
I don't know. Jamie, could you be more specific? Jamie Rosenblatt? Sorry
And
if
I'll
I'm
just,
saying your name
and
wrong.
I'll just say
The food hub and the three examples shared. Thank you, Jamie.
the three examples, they arose from a need that was expressed by the community. We had community members in different levels come up, from community gardens. People are saying, hey, we want a garden here. They were approaching the city. The city didn't have any resources to deal with it, and it sort of fell apart. So there wasn't anybody out there helping facilitate the process. Same with farm to school. There was different families, there was different teachers, there was different folks to say, we want to see more of this, but nobody was facilitating that process. And then the food hub arose out of really the farm to school movement and the need for larger scale wholesale, where the actual farmers and the food service staff and directors said, we can't do this unless there's a mechanism to get us wholesale at a larger level. So each one developed organically. Again, opportunity opens. Question is, do we have the time, the privilege, and the ability to facilitate this process to make it happen?
And finally, I think a lot of people were getting excited about, just remembering that someone said it's a slow burn. This is the long game. This is not, it's a revolutionary conversation, perhaps, if we're talking about just the, normal course of business and normal ways that funders, fund things, the normal ways that grants are structured, et cetera. But it's not a revolutionary act that happens overnight. It's something that, slowly things get done. You're redesigning for the immediate future with the community-driven process in mind. And then one action comes up and you're like, oh, let's do this. This is what people want. Oh, and it leads to this, which leads to something else. And then again, it becomes something that's just the way a community does things. So like community gardens, for example, is just, people see a lot of community gardens around our county, Lake and Mendocino counties now, and they're just like, well, how come I don't have a community garden in my, place? Or the city just knows, the city of Ukiah, where we live, it's like they're building community gardens into the city planning process now, as opposed to it, which someone asked about institutional commitments. It just becomes the way things are done. But it's slow. It takes a long time. It's like changing a culture.
It's a culture shift. And that idea of where to start. I once had a good friend when they were looking at a big overgrown lot and trying to figure out like, there's so many things to do and feeling anxious about it and what. And he had the greatest advice. He said, you know what, Miles, just start. Just start. And that's what we want to do right now, is we want to shift into, how do I just start this? So all those questions, hopefully now that you can get pen to paper, is we're going to say, what specific actions can you do? So what we're going to do is we're going to shift into redesigning and designing your process in your program.
And just to tag on to what Miles said around just start, just this last year, I think, I don't even know who it was, but someone just reminded me, progress, not perfection. So, and again, I think that that's something that we have to release, and perfection is, one of the ways in which the white supremacist culture manifests itself in the workplace, is this urge to get it right. And again, it's just take a step, just do something, and then things begin to illuminate. So we're going to take time, as Miles said, to work on your program. Annalena just shared the worksheet if you hadn't gotten it in the past. If you're someone who likes to print things, maybe you've printed it out and you're going to follow along, can also just open the PDF. If you've got an advanced version of Adobe Acrobat, you can use fill-in sign to work within the document itself. Or you could just take some notes as we're moving along and print it out later to work with your team or your organization. We're going to first go through the worksheet, then we're going to take some time in breakout groups to actually work on it, and then come back together and talk as a larger group.
So, the worksheet, we're going to take 2 minutes to tell you what it's all about and what's happening with it. So if you have that in front of you, great. If you don't, here's what it looks like. The first 2 pages, called Part 1, Pre-Assessment. Now, some of you say, well, we've already done some of this work. My community, we've already uncovered values, their outcomes. We've already identified and helped facilitate, what skills, capacities they have. Great. Part 1 and 2 are about, part 1 of the pre-assessment is about you already doing that. If you haven't done this work and you're like, These are great questions. You might not be able to answer these yet. You need to work in facilitating that conversations and that information from the community you're working with. And this worksheet, you know, you're going to see circles on it and stuff. It's for you, for those nonlinear thinkers, if you want to just fill in little bubbles. You don't have to have huge, big ideas. Let's just jot things down. Let's get it out of our heads. Let's get it off the shelf. And what does this look like? Too often we go to a training or a conference and we hear a great idea, and then we go back and we get really busy and forget about it. So we wanted to build some time into you to start just getting some ideas down with us here, helping you problem solve as we go through it. So page 1 is looking at if you already know what those desired outcomes and skills are. Page 2, if you already have identified needed skills, capacities, and resources in your community and what they need to be shifted that are in your own organization. If you don't, you can maybe start with some of the things in your own organization. Like, you know, do I really need to be making all the phone calls? Do I need to be setting the agenda? Do I need to be organizing that meeting for the community meeting? Maybe those are some of the things that you might say, I can already shift. And I don't know how yet, but I know we don't need to do those, because if we go away, nobody's going to be around to do them. So those are the first 2 pages. Then the second part is action planning. Jen, you want to hit that?
Sure. So when we talk about action planning in this context, we're really talking about the things that can be done within the next 3 to 6 months. We're talking about short-term actions for a longer-term gain. And as we talked about, like, for example, with the Food Hub project, there was like years of planning that went into it becoming what it is today. So, you know, looking at step 1, what are some specific actions that you can take within the next 3 to 6 months? Like, is there a facilitation process that you can engage in to build relationships and start to uncover some connections and knowledge in the community, or elevate some of those common values? And in step 2, establishing community outcomes, assets, and needs, thinking about specific actions like, you know, what can I do, or what can our organization do to begin a backwards planning process from those stated outcomes that the community has said that they want to have as outcomes? You know, what specific things can we do to support the community with resources and skills to reach these outcomes and be self-sustaining, etc. Next page. And then the 4th page of the worksheet is has step 3 and step 4. And so again, we're looking at specific actions in the next 3 to 6 months. You know, what you know, needed trainings can we get organized and bring to this community? How can we connect with other communities that could potentially share their wisdom and ideas? Can we, you know, acquire and share some money or some land or equipment? And do any other trainings. And then step 4, being patient and getting out of the way. You know, what specific action can I take, or can our organization take, to set realistic outcomes for our funders? Start having some of those conversations. Who do I need to call? And you know, maybe set up a virtual coffee date with and talk about the work that we're doing. How can we take a challenge that maybe just arose and turn it into an opportunity for some new training or provide some additional support? And maybe there's something that you need to take on. I mean, one of the things that came up in the on day 1 last Thursday was this idea, well, if we realize our vision and our missions and those outcomes the community has set forth, well, then wouldn't there be some tending that would need to happen? And we talk a lot about, just in our conversations, Miles and I, about, you know, transitioning the organization itself to, you know, to take on some new work. Well, so what is that tending? And, you know, some folks mentioned in the chat about, like, well, you know, what about transitioning, you know, the leadership from a funder or from a founder to some other group of people taking on the work? Well, when the shifts begin to happen, the organization may need to redesign to take on different levels of work or support or facilitate things in new ways. And that conversation needs to happen. So maybe your specific action is making time for that. So any specific questions, needs for clarification just about the worksheet itself? Because then we'll talk about more in depth about your program as we go into our breakouts, but any just real questions just about the worksheet? How do I access it? So Annalena shared the link to the PDF. So if you just go back up and scroll through the chat, you should be able to find that, Jose. Oh, she just posted it again. There you go. But yeah, it looks like no other specific questions unless there's anyone out there who just has a specific question about the worksheet.
And we'll write back to you on that unless it's general. So what we're going to do here, and I encourage you to stay in this space, and you've committed the time for today, so stay in it to work on your program and take these ideas and utilize us and others as sounding boards. Annalena and Andrew are going to break us into 2 breakout rooms. I'm going to be in one, Jen's going to be in another. We'll stay there. I don't know if we'll have music playing at this point. I think we won't, so we can actually hear. And we'll be around for clarifying questions like, I'm stuck on this. This is my program. What do I do? You can either put it in chat box or you can raise your hand and Jen or I will talk to you. And if you like, you know what, I want to be here for my 15 minutes and then come back. We're going to come back as a group and share out a few ideas so you can learn from each other. But if you prefer to turn off the volume while you're in there so you can work for those 15 minutes, set an alarm or look up and go, oh, wait, we're pulling out of the chat box, we're going back to share. That's great, but take this time. Don't get busy with your other stuff. It's really easy, you know, to say, okay, that was great. Thanks for this. I got the worksheet. I'm leaving. Take the time and get some ideas on paper. Start working it with the group. So we're going to break into those and we'll be in each one of those again. We'll come back here in about 15 minutes and keep in mind as you go through this, that framing, if I or my organization were to disappear, funding disappeared, we disappear, what needs to happen so the community's outcomes and work continues? That's kind of a great way to think about design and redesign.
So also before we go, someone posed a question just kind of saying that what I'm guessing is that their mission feels really broad or their objective feels really broad and long-term and big. The real thing to identify is what's going to be happening in the community that you're working with or that you want to shift power to when this has been accomplished. What will you see?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, what is actually happening for equity and sustainable food systems? What does that mean? What does that really look like?
Yeah. Walk outside,
so
what do you see happening? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so just maybe choosing one of those things from that, that vision that arises and then beginning to backward plan from there.
Great. Okay, to the breakout rooms, and I'll be in one, Jen will be in the other. We're there to answer questions. We'll talk about it through the chat or through people raising their hand and get to work.
In our conversation, and this, I think this is also coming up in the chat earlier, was how to do that part one, just sitting here, you know, in a workshop without actually being in community and having that conversation about what are the desired outcomes amongst the community. And I think that's the real intention of the tool. So for the purposes of today, it was just like practicing, like trying to choose something that you could then practice with. And kind of work through in an iterative way. But I think, you know, overarching, like the driving point here is that this process is done in partnership with the people that you are working with, whatever community that may be. So, you know, as I was looking at the tool today, I was thinking about my team and like, what is it with my team that I would like to see? And that I know that we've already talked about is like me sharing more leadership with the team and having them involved in more visioning and strategy work, and me not holding all of that power. And so I used the tool to practice that. And so I think, you know, the idea of using the tool was really just to try to kind of like flex those muscles, but that the intention of it is more longer term process in partnership with the people that you work with and serve. Miles, it looks like you and Jen, are y'all back?
Yeah, we're back.
Hey.
Look, it happened. We knew it could happen. We're back. I think our internet's coming back on too. Anyhow, thank you, Susan, for sharing. And that's the idea. Any other kind of challenges people are having or insights about that, we'll take a couple of minutes to do that. Feel free. And we can't quite see yet, so maybe if Susan or Andrew or somebody wants to call on people who raise their hand to share out some of their concepts while we jump back in.
Yeah, please feel free to, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm back, Miles, so you might be able to get back on. But one of the questions that came up earlier that I thought you'd be really great at addressing, Miles, since you have direct experience with this, is that someone mentioned, and I lost the chat, so I don't have full access to it again, but there was a question about I've been working with school gardens. We, had all this great work happening. We were there, and then we left the schools and they just went to weeds. And now we're thinking about putting some garden educators in, but we're afraid that the process is going to have a similar result. So how might you use this process?
Great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. So similar things happen in our community, and I think I'm back coming in here. Great.
Okay.
No, I'm back. Sorry. We said, who's the community here? And for a garden that's in an agency or a school, it's really, it's a staff's position. It's a school district. So we actually, the community was the teachers and the staff. So we actually facilitated and we asked for faculty meeting time. And we met with faculty, and then we asked for a team of faculty, because we're like, they have to own the process. If this garden is, they were always looking for parents or an outside group to do it. Like, no, this is a school. It's a classroom of the school. And so if the teachers didn't want it and the admin didn't want it, and there was no parents advocating directly with them, then it wasn't going to happen. So a great way to do this is to go back and either with the PTA, and in conjunction, it has to be with the teachers and the faculty and the administration. If they take ownership of it in some way and you help design it with them as outcomes, which it can be very effectively done, then that's, again, they own it. They own the process, they own the design, and then they'll take over the running of it with support from parents and others. But it has to be whoever is that key person where the power needs to be. If it's out here and the parents go away, it goes away just like you did. If it's with an organization, it goes away. The school garden is a classroom. It's a faculty and admin. It's the garden that needs to own that. Yeah, other hands going up or other kind of, we'll take about one more kind of takeaway or comment, because that was a great question.
You can also use the raise your hand option if you look on participants and then raise your hand, and then you can unmute and ask your question that way as well.
Good. I'm glad people, yeah, staff is key. They're your community. Yeah, there's different communities we talk about. All right, well, in our last few minutes, we want to keep everybody on time here. Been some really great discussion. I hope you're getting this. In the chat box, if everybody just stops for a moment, and we've been here for 2 sessions, almost 3 hours together. For some of you, it's reaffirming what you already knew and like, oh, that's right. Or you got one idea. All you need is one takeaway from this, and it's successful. Is go ahead and in the chat box, put your one insight or your one takeaway, and people can look at that, but cement that right now. Just kind of hold that and cement that.
I'm gonna express something I'm seeing as a takeaway, is that there's a need for this conversation specific to food banks. And it seems like there's a lot of people out there who want to have that conversation. So perhaps, maybe Annalena and folks could help just kind of piece out some of those people who mentioned in the chat about that food bank conversation and connect them with each other in some way.
We're actually thinking of some different ways to do some continued engagement around this topic with smaller groups. So that will be something that we definitely hone in on and can do some connections there.
Great. It's all right. There's over 100 of you out there. Come on, throw it out in one takeaway. Think about it. One thing.
Progress, not perfection. That community has lots of different meanings. Slow burn, facilitate, don't lead. Someone asked about the emergent, evolving, strategic thinking. There's an amazing book out there called Emergent Strategies. I highly recommend you read it. Giving power builds power. Yes. Remembering patience. It's not about you, it's about the community, totally. We're moving in the right direction. Just start, put ideas on paper and share them.
Great. All right, people keep putting those out there. Excellent. In the name of time here, let's talk about what happens next.
So, and Annalena, correct us if we're wrong, but you're going to send out any follow-up documents or put some of this information on the Food Service Leadership Network website in some format or another.
That is correct.
Okay, great. And we're going to send another evaluation.
We will do that too. And we
Okay.
might even put it in the chat box this time. So keep your eyes peeled for that.
Okay. And Miles and I are putting it out there. I mean, if anyone wants to email us, and our emails we'll follow up with those. We'll have a chat with you for 15 minutes or a little bit more. Just reach out and we'll be happy to talk with you in more depth. You can also share this concept with other people, whether share the recording of the boot camp itself, the 2 sessions, or we have this on our website as a course, and we can offer like discount codes and stuff. It's only $35, but we're not trying to sell it. We'll offer some discount kind of thing like that. But if you want to reach out to us, we can be found at kitchentableconsulting.com, just Jen at or Miles at, and we'll share this information with you later. But, we're here to help and engage in the conversation with all of you. And we're just grateful that all of our friends and colleagues in the food systems change world are engaged with passion and heart, and that we're all doing this for such beautiful reasons, for such beautiful outcomes for our communities.
Great. Thanks everybody for all of your deep engagement. There's been lots of great comments, lots of great thinking, and we hope to continue that on. Be safe, take care of yourselves, and to be continued.
Hey, I want to quickly just throw in
Thank
a
you.
plug here. I just want to thank Miles and Jen and Annalena for putting this series together. And also just really want to encourage all as FSLN members that if you have an idea about how you'd like to keep this conversation going and to plug in with other folks that are on the call today to really kind of work through these challenges together,